Hello, my name is Lincoln Rice. I'm the coordinator for the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. Welcome to our Facebook Live session on war tax resistance. So this is more of a War Tax Resistance 101 webinar, and there'll be time if you have comments or questions during the session, feel free to put those in the chat, and depending on how things are going, I may answer them at the time or kind of wait to the end of the presentation that I have. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, so again, this is about not paying for war. War tax resistance is a method to resist US militarism. So some important disclaimers from the beginning. Some of the methods that I'll be presenting are not legal, and anyone who practices them should be prepared to face the risks of civil disobedience, which we'll get to. Also, the government's laws and policies are subject to change. So this is February 2023. This is reflecting what we know and what is current for the situation right now. We're not anticipating any drastic changes in the near future, but that can always happen with IRS and IRS policy. So war tax resistance counselors, we don't give tips on how to fudge, cheat, or employ gimmicks or a way to avoid taxes. It's more about practicing what's at the depths of one's conscience, or trying to align our values with where we put our money. Also, normally someone giving this might state that they're not an accountant. My background actually is in accounting. My undergrad is in accounting from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. But other than that, I'm not a financial advisor or a lawyer. I'm not qualified to give investment or financial planning advice or legal advice. But this presentation is kind of based on a shared experience among war tax resistors over the decades. So again, I mentioned my name is Lincoln Rice. I'm the coordinator for the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, which is a mouthful. We often just call it NUTRIC for short. And we're a coalition of groups across the United States that have worked for 40 years now to support people who refuse to pay taxes for war and violence. And so there are local war tax resistance groups across the United States. They're not, we're not like their headquarters. They're not subsets of us. It was in fact individuals and local groups that 40 years ago, in order to have more of a national clearinghouse for information and a way to connect on a national basis, created NUTRIC. So in that sense, we might be set up a little differently than some other national groups. So why am I giving this presentation today? Why are there war tax resistors? Goes back to the root of the issue, which is US militarism. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all the details here, but the pie chart makes quite obvious when we're looking at the percentage that each country is spending on the military globally. The United States far surpasses any other country when it comes to military spending. It also is an issue not on the global scale, but even with our own federal budget, where most years is close to 50% of the military, of the federal budget is dedicated to past and present and future military expenses. This pie chart is put together by the War Resistors League, and this was based on a proposed budget to the president kind of before we knew about all the billions of dollars that would be going on in military aid toward Ukraine's. And this also included this also includes funds for COVID. So actually for 2023, we thought the amount for military spending was actually going to shrink as a percentage, at least for the first time in decades. But when it's actually said, when all is said and done, it'll probably end up being close to 50% again. Exploring it a little further, there's not only the military budget, but issues at the border. For some, the existence of federal prisons. For others, the conditions of federal prisons. the militarization of police. We see here on this in this picture a tank that the Lakeland Police Department in Florida was able to obtain from the federal government through its 1033 program, which allows local police departments in the United States to acquire military-grade weapons for free or for very low prices. The environment, we won't be spending a lot of time on these kind of background issues, but for many war tax resistors, the environment is a huge issue, a huge concern, the climate crisis, and knowing that the US military is the #1 institutional user of oil in the world, with most of that going for jets. Jets just use an enormous amount of oil. The average US military jet flying for 2 hours uses about the same amount of gasoline that the average American uses driving their car over a period of 2 years. I'm not going to go through all of these, but here are some highlights of war tax resistance history. Essentially, it seems like any civilization we have enough knowledge about has had instances of war tax resistance as a practice. I'll just highlight the first and the last here. The first recorded instance that we're aware of in what is now known as the United States, it goes back to the 17th century when an Algonquin tribe refused to pay taxes for the building of a Dutch fort. More recently, beginning in 2021, with a coup in Myanmar, millions of people in Myanmar, also known as Burma, began refusing to pay their utility bills as a way to defund the military regime, which depends on the public utility and payments to public utility to fund itself. So to counteract this, the government there has been sending soldiers to people's homes to demand payment. So we'll see that the consequences here in the United States are usually not quite so intimidating. Which tax resistance method is right for you? Again, this can be one of the things that scares some people off when it comes to war tax resistance. There's the fear of the IRS, but there is also the fact that it can be complicated. Some would say it allows us greater freedom because there's so many ways to practice war tax resistance. But there are two sides of the same coin, I suppose. So depending on a resistor's goals, risk tolerances, their values, their life situation, maybe they're in a partnership or a marriage with someone who is not as interested in war tax resistance, this could lead them to practice a different type of war tax resistance. So there are many methods. But basically, though there are many methods, they kind of fall into two overarching categories. The first being that someone refuses to pay all or some of their federal income tax return. And the second is, and that would be an illegal method. Excuse me, the second is that someone chooses to earn less than the taxable amount. So for this coming tax year, 2023, the standard deduction is nearly $14,000. So a single individual could earn just up to that amount and owe no federal income taxes. Going back to the first one, if some folks refuse to, who want to keep a lower risk tolerance, may just choose a symbolic amount of $100, $500, something where there's low risk. For others, because it's usually about 50% of federal income taxes that are redirected to the military, they might resist that amount. And for others, the thought being that half of whatever I give to the federal government goes to the military, may choose to refuse the payment of any federal income taxes. So the photo here is just a reminder, this isn't something new. Our current kind of war tax resistance movement in the United States dates back to the end of World War II, and these are considered the founders of our modern war tax resistance movement in the United States. So if you're an employee and you're wanting to resist federal income taxes for war, oftentimes your first thought might be, well, I can't, my taxes are removed by my employer. But You may recall your first day of employment or when you were first offered the job, your employer gave you a W-4 form. And on that form, depending on what amount of deductions you put on line 4B, you can either reduce or eliminate your withholding. I'm not going to go through that form here because it can be complex and intimidating. But if you either go to the link on this slide, and I'll put the links in the description at the end of this video, or if you just Google Nutric and W-4, you'll find our resources on this. We have a kind of a one sheet, two-sided resource. It's kind of the quick, easy way to do it. A more in-depth small booklet that goes really in depth, and a video that also explains it. But really, this is just the first step. It allows you to practice war tax resistance. So when the time comes for you to actually file on April 15th, you can make the decision if you want to pay those taxes. So at the end of the day, if April 15th came around and you decided, I'm not comfortable with this, you could pay then and the IRS wouldn't mind. Also, for some folks, at the very least, even if they did decide to pay when April 15th came around, if before that you had been getting a refund and it wasn't because of filing for some federal program, such as the Earned Income Credit, you might be getting a refund simply because you're giving the IRS and the federal government a 0% interest loan. So this could at least eliminate that practice, and that would be perfectly legal. If you're self-employed, so you work as a contractor or consultant, your income may or may not be reported to the IRS. It kind of depends who you work for. If most of your self-employment work is for a corporation, they'll have you fill out a W-9 form where you write your name, address, social security number, and then at the end of the year, they'll send you and the IRS a 1099 income statement that lets the IRS know and you know how much you received. So with this, when you're self-employed, even if you receive this form, nothing's removed. On the other self-employed kind of common situation is perhaps, let's say you're a carpenter, you mainly work for individual families. That wouldn't be, the individual family is not required to have you fill out this W-9 or send you a 1099. So eventually, under that situation, you don't have any income that's reported to the IRS. In both of these, nothing's withheld, including your Social Security and Medicare taxes. So some resistors also choose to resist those taxes. Others, like myself, do choose to pay Social Security and Medicare. It's a program that I believe in, but the reason that some do not either goes back to their own political motivations, or it's a common practice throughout many presidential administrations to borrow from Social Security and Medicare from time to time. So no matter which one of those methods that someone chooses, when April 15th comes around, there's also the question of, should I file or not file? So one is on the left, you're more seen. The other, if you're not filing, you're slightly more hidden. And so what would be advantages or disadvantages to filing or not filing? If you file, you know that, especially if you're going to be in a collectible situation at some point, the IRS accurately knows how much you owe. Otherwise, if you don't file, at some point they may file for you and they'll never do it in an advantageous manner. They'll usually say that you owe more than you actually do, and then you might need to file an amended return, and it could end up being more of a hassle, but it depends on your situation. Filing does make it slightly easier for IRS collection. You're kind of letting them know that you owe taxes. Even if you make over the standard deduction and you're not filing, they might not be sure if you owe taxes or not. So even if they're being reported your income through a 1099 income statement or a W-2 at the end of the year, they might not be sure if you owe, and it might make them less interested in pursuing your case. A huge advantage for many people that choose to file is that it begins the 10-year statute of limitations for collection. So after 10 years from the time that your tax is assessed, the IRS can no longer go after you for those funds. I say when the tax is assessed. Oftentimes in the past, I might have said when your taxes were filed, but especially if you're a paper filer, the IRS is so far behind in processing paper returns that in the past, it might have been weeks or a month or two between those dates, but now they're almost a year behind in processing paper returns, which would delay the 10-year statute of limitations from beginning if you're a paper filer. Lastly, it makes it easier to apply for scholarships, health insurance subsidies. For student financial aid, being a war tax resistor would not injure your ability or hinder your ability to obtain those funds. But oftentimes, in order to verify your income, which they are concerned about, they like to do that by checking with the IRS about what you filed as your income for the year. For health insurance subsidies under the Affordable Care Act, you are required to file. So if you do not file, you'll either not be allowed to get on those subsidies, or at some point in the future, it'd probably be removed from those subsidies when they realize you haven't been filing. The decision not to file, where you're not sending in the forms, even if you do this, we suggest you fill out the forms anyways, so that if the IRS does come calling, you can dispute the amount owed. It does make collection harder for reasons I already went over. The statute of limitations would be delayed until they file the income tax forms for you, which might not be years until after the tax year. And there is an additional penalty for not filing. So if you view yourself as collectible, that could be a hindrance for decision not to follow that method. So the last part of this presentation, I'm going to focus on myths of war tax resistance. So there's always the thought, I think, put into us somehow as little children that we're going to go to jail. Very few war tax resistors have gone to jail in modern times. Really, since the end of World War II, there's only one person that's essentially gone to jail for refusing to pay federal income taxes. That was Tony Serra, a lawyer in 2005. And it appears because he's a lawyer and could understand exactly what laws he was breaking was perhaps the reason the IRS chose to prosecute him criminally. Otherwise, especially over the last 20, 25 years, other war tax resistors who have gone to jail have normally done so because they filed a fraudulent return. They essentially lied or misrepresented their income on their returns or took deductions that they should not have tried to take. And that's something that with the IRS's limited resources, they're willing to go after someone criminally. So we would definitely at least suggest that someone think twice before filing a return that's not accurate. The IRS will take my house, car, or other type of property. This used to be a very legitimate concern through the mid to late 90s. It was very common for people in our network during the 80s and 90s, especially to have a car repossessed or taken by the IRS. Houses at times also. But the IRS had a policy change in the late 90s. Part of it, there was a thought among the public that they were being too aggressive when they sometimes took these items. And so we saw, as this graph shows, we saw a movement in property seizures from about 10,000 plus to now about 1 to 400 items a year, though that's even been lower than that during the pandemic. The IRS will just end up getting more money from me in the end. So this is the last time the IRS this represents information from the last time the IRS shared this. They talk about the gross tax gap. And so the gross tax gap is money that they have estimated is owed to the IRS that people for some reason or another did not pay. So for the last year that they shared this information, that tax gap for that year was about $460 billion. The IRS's own estimates is that out of that $500 billion almost, at the end of the day, they'll end up collecting about 50 billion. So that's around 12 or 13%. So granted, this isn't just war tax resistors. This is a whole bunch of folks not paying federal income taxes for a variety of reasons. But even the IRS is quite honest that they'll only end up collecting about 12 to 13% of the amount not paid. War tax resistors don't pay for things our society needs. And so it's a common practice among war tax resistors to redirect funds if they're refusing to pay a certain amount to the IRS. And truthfully, for many war tax resistors, if we use the example of someone who maybe over the course of 10 years resists $30,000, to the military, that's a relatively minor amount, almost nothing really. But for groups or individuals or people that are really in need, this could represent a significant help. And so war tax resistors know that when they redirect these funds, they're really helping out programs and groups that are underfunded, and that this will help them do really good work. So then what are the actual risks? First, lots of letters. The IRS is very good. That their computer system, though it's antiquated, is excellent at setting out automated letters, certified mail, etc., letting you know. One of the reasons they do this, they estimate that just sending out a letter to someone will lead them to collect, or let me phrase this another way, 50% of all funds that they received, that's a tax debt that wasn't paid on time, they receive because they just sent out a letter. Those letters scare people, and it's their main way of getting tax debts paid to the IRS. After that, Social Security garnishment. It's another federal agency, so without much hassle or work, they can get if someone's receiving Social Security, they can garnish 15% without much hassle. They can take more, but it's unusual, and they need to go through some extra hoops and paperwork for that, but it's very common for war tax resistors to have 15% garnished from their Social Security. Salary garnishment, it's not as common, at least at this point. I often refer to it as the reverse lottery. It does happen. I'll hear from one or two folks a year in our network who have received a salary garnishment, but it's the IRS, again, a lack of resources preventing them to send out as many wage garnishments as they would like. Bank seizures, bank account seizures kind of fall in the same boat as a salary garnishment. State refunds, if you pay state income tax and you accidentally pay too much, the IRS may put a levy there. That's a common thing to happen. Interest and penalties, that'll definitely happen. The kind of a general rule of thumb is that over the course of 10 years with the interest and penalties, you may see a tax debt triple. So if you're resisting $100, it'll be about $300 before you hit that 10-year mark. $1,000 could become $3,000. We discussed the possible loss of health insurance subsidies if someone doesn't file. Also the difficulty in getting student loans if someone doesn't file. Once someone owes about $20,000, you may see a public lien filed in your local county. The main issue here would be if you owned a house and sold it, the IRS now would get first, they'd be first in line to get those funds before you do from the sale of the house. Sometimes they also file with a credit agency, which could hurt your credit, but they haven't been very good at notifying credit agencies of tax debts in recent years, but that could change. Also, possible loss of ability to renew a passport. This was a law enacted in 2018 that if someone owes a tax debt of $55,000 or more, they will not be allowed to renew their passport. You won't lose your current one, but you wouldn't be allowed to renew it. This may eventually be overturned in court, but there haven't been any significant court cases yet challenging this where the person had money. So now getting to the nitty-gritty here, near the end. Just wanted to at least touch base on the fact many of you may have heard that earlier this or last year, the IRS was given an influx of $80 billion over the next 10 years. So this is a huge increase for them. This will increase their budget by about 60% a year. At the end of 10 years, it'll double their workforce. But even by the IRS's own numbers, with the amount of funds they expect to collect and pass taxes due, it'll bring them to levels of collection about 10 years ago. Again, 10 years ago, they weren't that effective, but it also just speaks to how ineffective they've become in the last 10 years through lack of funding. So we don't expect property seizures again to become common, but things like wage garnishments and bank levies will probably become more common than they have been. A lot of this money will also just be going to general operations. Here's a photo showing some of the millions and millions of paper tax returns that the IRS still needs to process. If you've ever tried to call the IRS, at this point, they're answering an extremely low percentage of phone calls. It's almost impossible to get a hold of someone. So they'll be adding operators and tax service people and upgrading their technology. Their current computer system is about 20 years old. And so if you do receive a letter, at least under the current system from the IRS, you might notice it has an old feel. It's an old system with an old printer technology, and they'll be upgrading that also. A reminder of NUTRIC, the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. All of our resources are available for free. Again, we're not trying to sell anything. We're just a group of people wanting to share these resources out of conscience. And so they're available for free. We just exist on the graciousness of people who donate to us to make sure that we can keep making these resources available. But sometimes people prefer something in paper. If you go to our website, we'll basically just charge what it costs for copying and postage to send people stuff. But otherwise, if people are fine downloading, looking on your phone, we have a newsletter that comes out every other month, a blog, interviews. In this coming first weekend of May, we'll be having a gathering in kind of northern Indiana. All of that is available. All that information is available on the website. So here's just a general resource list, our website, the W-4 information. We have this counselors list. So war tax resistors that have done some additional training, who just volunteering their time are willing to talk to people who are considering war tax resistance. These counselors are organized by state on that page. So right now we have counselors, we have about 50 counselors in 35 states. So it also means it's maybe a way to connect with someone who's in your area if you wanted to learn more. We have a sign up for a free e-newsletter. And then last, I just want to mention the War Tax Resistance Penalty Fund. When someone is collected upon, they might, especially if you're being hit with those extra fines and penalties, this group is kind of a mutual aid group where they'll put out a call among its members to help reimburse someone, at least for the interest and penalties that were taken, so the hit won't be so big if they are collected upon. So in that sense, we do like to practice community, and there's a wonderful group here that's enjoys getting together and supporting one another on these issues.